mindful of your time, we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to call the September 15th, 2022 Land Use Advisory Committee meeting to order. And the agenda is approved as written unless somebody objects. Does anybody have any objections to the agenda? No, we're good. Okay. Make sure you pass around the zucchini bread and take some. I made that today, so it's nice and fresh.
We have to pass it?
You can have seconds. It can go around multiple times, okay? So first up on our agenda is the approval of the July 21st, 2022 Land Use Advisory Committee minutes. Do we have a
Motion to approve.
Phil makes a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second from Jerry. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay.
Abstain.
Okay, thank you. Meetings are approved. So our only other thing on the agenda is the community designations revisited again, and Raya and Paul.
Until you get tired of this. Hi, everyone. Paul and I are here to talk to you again about community designations, give you an update of the work, where it is, what we've done so far, and generally what we're hoping to achieve today. So just we're not going to revisit the background fully on the community designation. I think you have all become experts so far after so many meetings on this. But just giving you an overview of the project's progress. So we kicked off this project in January of this year, going to the CDC, the Community Development Committee, which basically officially directed LUAC to work on the community designation for a final recommendation to the Community Development Committee. And then we came to you for an overview of the project and what's going on and what to expect, what community designations are, the history, and so on. During the second quarter of 2022, as we had mentioned, I think I'm going to work on this.
It's delicious, by the way.
Thank you.
I will
I
work
just
on
got
this.
over by the coffee. Angela.
In the second quarter of 2022, as we had mentioned, this project has two main components, engagement and analysis. So in quarter two, we started our engagement with our focus groups, both external and internal. We also presented to the Metropolitan Council as a whole, was supposed to be a committee of the whole, but ended up being a Metropolitan Council meeting. We presented to the Metropolitan Area Water Supply Advisory Committee, and we have presented to LUAC several times. As part of the analysis that was done in second quarter of 2022, we did variable assessment, we worked on developing options based on those variables, and then in quarter three of 22, we continued with the engagement with the focus groups and you, as well as the analysis, just continuing that assessment, but instead of developing options, really trying to refine those options. Now in quarter four, which is, well, upcoming very soon. Yeah, so we're kind of like at the end of that refinement, but what we are hoping to achieve moving forward is continue that engagement with some external local government comment and feedback, focus group meetings, as well as we have a meeting upcoming from the regional planning advisory group, who is that advisory group for a bigger picture of regional planning process, as well as we'll continue to work with you. The analysis that we're hoping to continue on is that refinement, but also recommendation, description of those designations, and an evaluation of the densities, the minimum density requirements. So I have quarter one of 23 in here. We'll see whether that's needed or not. Our hope as that aggressive timeline was for you to come to a a recommendation to CDC, maybe by the end of this year, but if not, maybe in the first meeting of 23, to make that recommendation to CDC, and then for the CDC and the Metropolitan Council as a whole to consider that recommendation moving forward in the rest of the regional planning process. There are going to be ongoing refinements on this after the policies are developed. Policies associated with community designations are not part of this project themselves. However, later on when they're worked on, the land use policies, if there are instances when it seems that there is a complete mismatch between the policies and community, like a community designation of one or two communities, those will still change. So there are refinements kind of that will be coming later on. It's not going to be set in stone, and part of it will also be part of the forecast review when the forecasts are out and the growth projections for each community is defined, then we will be better able to potentially make any adjustments to community designations with those additional information. So before I move forward, I want to see if you have any questions on the project progress.
Yeah, I do. The last time I was completely lost. I didn't quite figure it out till I was driving home. I think I figured it out. So just for my own knowledge, what is the purpose of gathering all this information? And what are you trying to accomplish?
That is a really, really good question. The purpose of gathering all this information, our hope is to let this information inform us to better make, better create these community designations or put them together for the next steps of the regional planning process, which are the policies themselves. So this whole process of updating community designations, and we've been saying that from the beginning that it's possible that the final result may not look too different from what you already know of community designation, but the purpose of this whole exercise is to make sure that we have considered the different options, we have evaluated potential points of refinement and potential points of making it better, so that if anything, like trying to figure out if community designations were changed in the last round, can we make it better this time? So this was the whole purpose of this specific project, to make sure that at the end of it, we come up with a set of community designation that the rest of the regional planning process can use for policy making, specifically land use. But also the hope is that with the kind of the integrated effort on the regional planning process, even they are considered in even other policy plans, hopefully.
Well, I thought the other meeting was you were trying to figure out what communities are very similar, so then you could do something with it. Is that what it's all? I mean, so if this area is the same as this area, you're gonna have policies for these two areas, or
Yes.
that's what it's all about?
Yes, it's about grouping the communities that are most similar to each other, so that the set of policies that are coming later that basically applies to that group. Now there are potentially some differences in those groups based on specific features that will be present in those communities, but those will come later in the process, such as transit ways, like that would potentially call for special policies. But yes, the community designations themselves are about groupings of communities that are most similar. Do you want to add something, Paul?
Well, I was wondering if Angela, I mean, maybe one of the key pieces is just that density, allowable density aspect for these groupings.
That's the part of the policy development is.
You've got to talk louder, we can't hear you down here with the map.
That is the part of the policy development that is most important to local governments, I would say. The density requirements are tied to community designations in a lot of ways. And so groupings of communities with similar features, similar characteristics, tend to have the same density requirements, whether that's a minimum of 3 units per acre. For the more urban areas, it's a higher density requirement. And those land use policies will happen in the next year. Like, we're starting to scope that out now. We'll be bringing that in front of you as well.
So with all the data that Met Council must gather with everybody who works down here, you had to come up with another program to explain your data or something?
So are you answering the question, or do you
I
have?
think I have a clarification that will help him.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so, and you guys can correct me if it's totally wrong. So in our city, right, I've got, zoning code, right? And I've got my rules for what you can do by zone, right? The way I would analogize this is the regional community designation kind of aligns to what I would do locally as a zoning because I have policies that are tied to these designations, right? So it's a way to categorize, just like I categorize density, my low density residential, high density residential, moderate, I put those designations locally. This is a regional way of doing that. Is that
Sort of,
fair?
because we'll end up having rules effectively that
Right.
come out in the policies. And we want to have,
Consistency.
we know that Minneapolis and Rosemount are not the same and can't do the exact same rules, basically. So we have a set of rules for Minneapolis, St. Paul, and places that are like that. We have a set of rules for developing suburban communities. And this is just kind of putting these different communities into buckets where they're similar and would end up having similar rules in the policies. Right?
Yes, and I just wanted to add to that a little bit about that. This is not necessarily new. Like, since the very first regional development guide, the community designations were part of that, trying to just like create those groupings or those buckets for those policies. Basically, they were called geographic planning areas at that point, but the name changed. Like in the prior to that, it may have been like developing, like it was a little more straightforward, but as the communities have grown, and the differences in terms of, like for developed communities have, the characteristics have changed, like we have tried to make sure that the community designations speak to that, to capture those differences and to be able to customize those policies better as much as possible, to
Madam Chair, I actually have a question. Could you define connectivity and what's the difference between high and low?
Yes, I am going to start and then look to Paul to talk about that. I believe that you're talking about the slides that are coming up, right? The intersection density, the connectivity that you're seeing in the legend of the maps are based on, I can move forward just so you can see it for that purpose, just so everyone knows where we are. Connectivity is based on the one layer that's called intersection density. Intersection density basically, to put it, to say it very quickly, is basically how many intersections do you have in a given area. Basically, the more intersections you have, the more connected your area is, and less cul-de-sacs, and just basically just being able to go around. So between high and low is just trying to make it into a scale.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair.
Back to the thing.
On these community designations, does the community have an opportunity to have that conversation as far as whether or not they want the designation or if it fits them?
Absolutely. And now the changes, and we will be connecting with local governments and talking about, asking for their feedback, what it is that they believe, if these groupings make sense or don't make sense. And at the same time, I would say that, and we are going to refine it, and at the same time, the changes may not be drastic, like it's not gonna, like a community on the edge of Musa, if they say, I really just think I'm like the super dense, high, everything like Minneapolis, it just doesn't quite make sense. So there are limitations to those refinements, but there's definitely going to be conversation and communication about what that change is, why, like if it's just like a feeling or if it is like, no, really the character of our community is different, the development pattern is different, and this kind of designation cannot support our growth one way or another, then absolutely.
We had some communities change in their comp plan update process as they were going through it. They went, whoa, we have wooded areas and steep slopes and we can't do this density, so that's not gonna work. We need to switch to something else. That did happen where they changed. And we had one that went to the legislature and the legislature changed their designation, so.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, there's also opportunity during the planning process, so for amendments to happen as well. So along the developing edge, as communities add some areas to their local MUSA, that may result in a community designation change too. So we make those small adjustments within communities along the way as well during amendments to their comp plans as well.
We ready to keep going?
Well, it's just,
Still thinking over there.
it seems to me, I'm, you know, well, first to admit, I have very little knowledge about the workings of the Met Council, but it seems like if you got all these communities all spread out, with all the programs you have down here, don't they all overlap everything else? So having another one, how are you gonna have another one that would be better or works or something?
I'm gonna try to answer that and then I'll look at anyone else who wants to comment. I wouldn't categorize community designation as a program of the Metropolitan Council, but rather it's a basis for policies and specifically the land use policies. Now, the Metropolitan Council does have different programs that do some of the either follow community designations or take them into consideration in terms of like minimum density requirements and or consistency with other policies. But there isn't a situation when there will be a conflict between community designations as a basis for policy and other programs of the Metropolitan Council.
Phil?
If I may, this basically is, as I see it, this is, I don't want to call it a program, but it's something that, it's just a redesignation or a renaming of what's currently happening. It's just a refinement.
Yes.
Absolutely.
That's all it is.
Yeah, we already have it.
You already have it in place.
We already
It's just
have it,
refinement.
it's been in every plan all year long, because we can't
Right.
treat an agricultural community the same as an
Exactly.
urban community, so that we've got these different designations. Sometimes there's been as little as like 3 or 4, and this last one, we have a lot.
Right.
And these maps are looking at maybe paring it back a little bit, maybe we had too many designations the last time. That's what we're talking about today is, do we like how it was last time, or do we like any of these other options to make them just a little bit more broad and not so narrow?
I think with Jennifer's explanation, it was pretty spot on as far as how it comes together and how I would look at it. It's basically like its own.
Do we need a ton of buckets or fewer buckets to put
Yeah.
communities in, basically?
If I could just add, you know, thinking about the region, we have like 186 different communities, is it 186, 188 communities. So one size doesn't fit all when we think about regional policy. And rather than having 188 different policies, one for each community, we're trying to create these buckets so we can have, you know, you fit into this bucket, you fit into that one. So we can kind of simplify the planning process a little bit.
That makes sense, yeah.
Good question.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to also make sure everyone knows, not only as Chair Wolf said, that the region has these community designations in all of their previous plans, local governments have already responded to the community designations in their current comprehensive plan. Every single community already has a community designation. This process is really just to affirm or to identify where we might need to make updates. Since the last 10-year process, have communities changed a significant amount, a little? Are they largely the same? And this is really just to kind of feel that out.
April?
I'm wondering about sort of what I mean, and this probably would be a longer discussion that maybe we can't have right now, but I'm wondering what those designations basically mean for that city. So like, if, it's a city with a higher designation, does that mean that they're going to be expected to build more? Or does it mean that someone with a lower designation is gonna be expected to build more? Do you see what I'm saying?
The number is not yet figured out for any community. We'll have forecasts that do that. But how you get to whatever number you get, because they look at trends and where people want to live and housing types that people want and all of that when they do the forecast. But we set minimum densities for each one of these categories. So the yellow part would be 3 units per acre, and the orangey part would probably be 5. And they get bigger as you get farther in because the economics of building require higher density to make the dollars work in those more dense communities, and the infrastructure is already there, and you're trying to make use of the infrastructure that's there, right?
Yes, and to add to what Chair Wolf said, some of the, like the minimum density requirements, especially for as you're getting closer to the core of the region where most of the cities don't have greenfield anymore. So they accommodate their forecast and their minimum density requirement through redevelopment versus the other ones that are probably gonna be development. So we are looking at the areas that are designed for growth, not what's necessarily existing.
Okay.
So that's like the looking into like 20 years from today.
So do you make a differentiation between, it's like a city that has like a tax base like Brooklyn Center and what you would designate them to build based on their density versus a more affluent but urban city that has similar density?
Maybe Diamond.
Thank you.
If I may, we don't include or haven't included any measure of like net tax capacity and the community designations to inform that necessarily. It's more about capacity for development, capacity for like what's the land supply basically, which is considered in forecast as well. And the forecast model is much more complicated than that and includes many, many more things. Birth rate and death rate, and that's like the simplify. And then basically with that identifies what kind of growth that community will get. And then as part of this project, as I mentioned, we will have density evaluation, not necessarily what that number will be, but rather what those numbers are right now and how would that respond to potential future growth. So that informs the next step of this process, which is the land use policies that do include those minimum density requirements in a combination of looking at forecast and that evaluation of current densities.
So does the, designation affect like, or what you require the city to build, does it have like a specific, like, a certain number of affordable units, a certain number, nothing like that?
That's a whole separate discussion.
Okay.
There's different long discussions for each step of the way. The designations we've been talking about all year, and then forecasts will go on for at least a year discussion with cities. Do you really think you could take this many people, or do you want more? There's a back and forth on that. And the affordable housing allocation is a whole nother long discussion to figure out how many units the whole region needs and what formula we're gonna divvy them up by, and that only happens once every 10 years.
Right. I'm mainly just asking this based off of, a lawsuit that our city was part of where we were trying to hold you guys accountable to making sure that other cities are also building affordable housing because we have like 85%. So
Right.
we're being like required to continue to just build more and more. You're not helping us build our tax base.
No,
At all.
And when we set the affordable housing numbers the last time, we took into consideration in giving out the allocations, how much affordable housing you already had.
Okay,
So you got a smaller number than if you were Edina.
I gotcha. Thank you.
And then, as you say, and then isn't it, like, we have a neighbor city who said, I'm never gonna build affordable housing. And it just means that they don't can't come to you for grants. and-
They can't get livable communities grants,
Yeah.
basically, yeah.
I'd like to piggyback on what Councilmember Graves talked about. Would the designations then put cities into a situation in order to meet minimum densities? Because what would follow would be the density requirements. Would this then put cities into situations in which they have to, in order to meet those requirements, it almost forces the cities to be partners in a TIF district or an abatement district or something like that in order to meet these requirements and those designations? You know, I'm trying to figure out what horse is pulling the cart, right? Because if the designation's gonna require that, then you're forcing cities to do things that they may not wanna do in order to meet the density requirements.
I can respond to that. The minimum density requirements, as I mentioned, is just for new development and redevelopment. How the city achieves that is up to the city. We don't require the city to do TIF or any other kind of implementation tool. That is how they will decide to do it. What they would need in order to meet that minimum density requirement is a realistic mixture of realistic as in for the city themselves, that it makes sense for them and for the vision, mixture of different land use categories, residential categories that provides that capacity for a range of densities that will help them meet that minimum density requirement.
And how you make that range is up to you. I mean, there are some communities that do
Yeah, you can do a mixed
all
use
single
versus- I get-
family
I
and
get-
then one big apartment chunk of land to get their overall density. And there's others that do a lot in the middle or a range or whatever. It's that you have a lot of local control over, more than you realize.
Well, I'm sure.
But you also have somebody who wants to build it. And if
Well,
nobody
and that
wants,
was my point of, we're not the developer, the developer's gonna
Right.
come to us and if we're bringing a new area into the MUSA and we're bringing, this is now part of the designation density requirements, but the developer's saying it's not meeting their ROIs, so the city's gotta come in and incentivize in order to get that development done, and that's what I'm saying, is you're almost forcing the city's hand in the development or redevelopment situations in order to meet those requirements.
but you are allowed to just say, no, we can't do that, and what density would
But
you
I
like?
also wanna build a tax
Right.
base, so
But
yes, we can.
what density would you like to make this work?
Okay.
You know, do you need 4 stories in order, or whatever, to make it work? You can do that. We don't require TIF or any city subsidies for development. That's a local decision. But looking at the market, you as elected officials have to look at what are the different drivers of development and what part do you want to play in that to make your city develop the way that you would like it to develop.
Fair enough.
Chair Wolf, may I add
Yes.
something? And from experience of having looked at so many of the 2040 plans, I would say that most cities did not have a problem meeting their minimum density requirements. In fact, many of them are way above because of the way that they have done their future land use planning. And in many times that gives them, like, especially when they do some areas that make more sense potentially for mixed use or higher density, and then some areas that gives them that flexibility of the different kind of residential land uses. And later on, if there is an amendment that, if there's a project that the city is trying to get that development to come in, we have gone through many land use amendments that have changed the land uses to a different density category based on the need and the market. We see that as a normal part of the process because we see the comprehensive plan as a living document that you cannot potentially, like, possibly know at one point in time what is going to happen in the next 10 years. So it definitely adds into that flexibility and, like, in coming in and working on it. And sometimes the density may go down, sometimes it may actually go up. It depends on what that market
And
is.
Raya, I'm gonna stop you for a
Yes.
second because April
I was
needs
done.
to leave, so I wanna give you the chance to give whatever input you want to before you have
Yeah.
to head out.
Well, thank you, I appreciate that. Without really having seen, the rest of the presentation and had a chance to really understand it, I would say that in general, I prefer to have a little bit more of a nuanced understanding of the designations. Like, so I would guess maybe I'd lean more towards C than A, right? I don't know clearly, I mean, I have an idea what, whatever, the temperature, which is what was like in the C1 would mean, but I don't know exactly, how does that affect, people's health or, what's the point of using that as part of the designation? So if you could answer that quickly, then maybe I'll be able to give you a little bit more.
Actually, we're gonna look at your call.
You're gonna look at me to that. Well, I'm not sure, okay. I'm thinking about other messaging here, but I'll try to just step back to the basic of your question. So when we looked at including land temperature in a variable, we end up with a grouping that looks like what we see here. And when we look at the actual values that are associated with intersection density, median year built, planned residential density, and the land temperature, the distinctions that come out is that the gold or the orange are very similar in all of the variables except for the year built, which is it's kind of interesting. There is a difference in the land temperature also, but what we're seeing is it's more of a distinction of the year built, and what it indicates is that the orange communities are slightly older than the ones that aren't, which isn't too surprising. I mean, we know that they've been there a little bit longer than Carver, or maybe that Carver's a bad example, but Eden Prairie, where it's a much younger community. So when we looked at the variable, it seemed to make a very interesting grouping that could be applied to or not just density, but policies. When we think about older communities have different challenges than younger communities. They're looking at more redevelopment opportunities. Maybe they have housing concerns or issues. Maybe there is connecting people to other attributes, schools and things like that, that maybe the younger ones they're still developing and they can guide development in that way to meet that. Why I was hesitant to start going with that is we've heard a lot of language, and I'm not sure if we want to go into that, a lot of language from the focus groups about strong concerns about this variable, maybe for some of the same reasons why you're asking. And I'm looking to Raya and Angela about whether we want to dive into that at this point. What are your thoughts, Raya, on this?
I guess I will look back at did that answer your question? Do you want to dig
somewhat.
in more? Okay.
A little more, please.
Okay, yes, then I will jump, I can.
Okay.
Take it from here. So some of the concerns about including, and that's not necessarily just for this variable, but overall, like what combination of variable you want to include is basically trying to see what does including this variable mean? What are we trying to say? Are we trying to emphasize that this is more important or not? Are we how are we able to say how is the community designation related to this variable? Like, why is my land use policies being somewhat dictated by this specific variable? So there was a lot of concern about something like land surface temperature not being a good variable to differentiate communities, like as a basis for differentiation of communities, especially because a lot of it has to do with, for example, how much tree coverage you have, and that could be very different in a community that's old versus a community that's newer, a community that is agricultural, but a community that isn't, but is also building and smaller trees versus the one that have grown a little bit, how many rows. So there was quite a bit of concern about this variable not being a good representative of something that we should use for groupings of communities.
Okay.
And it's not necessarily representative of anything health related.
No.
It's that stuff hasn't been developed yet, so there's green space that tends to be colder than developed areas. And these are supposed to be sort of long-term designations, but that temperature stuff can change. If you have a whole lot of development, it could bump you into a different category because you have development where before it was undeveloped land.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we were thinking that, the land temperature is kind of correlated with land use and the type of use. You have a lot of impervious surface. You know, so there is a relation to land use, but we don't we're just going at it a little bit different. But yeah, I think a lot of people were just very concerned about, that means something about climate, something about temperature that they need to have described in your policies. And I think they were having a hard time being able to understand that, and thinking more so they'd have a hard time conveying that to the constituents, what that means. And they, you know, may have a very valid point on that. I think we were kind of approaching it as, you know, whatever variables went in it, clearly are gonna be part of the messaging of that grouping, but it's gonna go much further than that. Just because we don't include land temperature doesn't mean that there's not gonna be some discussion about land temperature or the climate aspects that go into any community designation. So it just might be, it's a messaging concern.
Well, you know, I tend to give the public a little more credit to be able to understand things if you can explain it to them in a clear way than maybe the average elected official might, but, so I don't know, I don't really feel like I have a super clear understanding of all of it, but I think, you know, from what I can sort of surmise from this discussion and just intuitively, I would say, you know, proposal B or C makes more sense than what we're doing right now, from my perspective. So, with that, I'm gonna get out of here.
Thank you for
Thank you.
making the drive in here.
Yeah, I'm sorry I've
Your other
been
things that you
absent.
had going on.
Sending me a text to remind me is really helpful.
I'm glad that helped. I'm gonna give Bill a chance to talk.
Just
That's
one
fine.
quick comment, being part of this about 30 years, if I count my planning commission, and 3 comp guide plans to the cities and suburbs, it's always been density, the conflict issue and designation. But I'd say in this next go around, the market's changed already. That density, I'm guessing you're having comp guide plan changes I'd like to see in the last 18 months, that the builders in the market, because of land cost and building cost, are putting in the density. It's the only way they're coming out of the ground. So again, I'd say all this angst that's been around for the last 30 years is automatically disappearing. Even in the townships. That's a high-level view, and I might be wrong, but I'm willing to bet.
Okay, who did I interrupt over here? Dan?
You didn't interrupt me, I was just looking for recognition. So as I looked at proposal C and I looked at kind of the breakdown of the different categories, it did appear to me that both land temperature and intersection density sort of broke down the same way in this particular proposal. The thing that sort of created the 4th category, different color, was on actually the median year built was the thing that actually split some of those cities into a lighter color than before. Because if you look at intersection density, once again, and land use temperature, the breakdowns between the categories, the lines are the same. And so I'm wondering if the concept of land temperature is something that just starts to get too much confusion in people or another thing for people to try to work into everything. Maybe the way to address it is that actually the differentiation is that year built. And you've added another tier in the year built of median to new, between new and median. And that is what changed some of these communities from the darker orange to the lighter orange. And then once again, some of the communities from the lighter orange to the blue, because of that, then those are just the newest built. So if that helps in people's understanding of it, maybe taking the land temperature out can work as long as you, and still get you maybe the number of categories you may want to have. If
Well, and that's the bigger question.
Well, that's
Do you
exactly-
want that many
exactly.
categories, or is it okay if
Right.
some of the blue is yellow instead?
Well, and that's the thing, exactly. Should some of the yellows be actually orange and should some of the blue be yellow? I mean, yeah, that is the question that ultimately we have to figure out. What is the thing that differentiates those categories, and is the year built the thing?
Phil?
Yeah, I have to agree with Dan. I think that the year built makes more sense. I thought proposal B made more sense. I wasn't really understanding the surface temperatures, I think it's kind of a Pandora's box. Trying to explain it to, because it's just, we had a long discussion about it already. Trying to do, as April said, explain it to our constituents, it's like, okay. It's going over our heads.
People are gonna make assumptions about what that is.
Exactly,
Mhm.
It's- I think it makes more sense to Dan's point is to look at year bill, that to me makes more sense.
Raya.
I could follow up.
Well, I was just gonna comment to Dan's comment. That's what I was trying to convey, is it really comes down to year built. But the interesting thing is if you don't add the land temperature, you don't get that distinction. It starts to lump, the year builts lump together and you end up with the option B. So
But in
that's
the-
the interesting thing.
Yeah, but in B you had old year built, median year built, and new. There were just 3 categories.
Right.
In C, you did have 4 categories of year built, and so that's what became the differentiation. It appears to have become.
Well, yeah, keep in mind, this is just a generalized statement to try to give you something rather than using old designation names. So it was my effort to just try to give you a sense of what is going on in those. But if you actually look at the values associated with these variables, there is this distinction. And the higher ones are the first couple and the lows are the lowest when we look at the median values.
Sure, I was just going
Yep,
based on
yep.
the wording and the
Right,
description of the
right,
categories.
exactly.
Definitely in proposal C, the year built had a 4th tier added to
Right,
it in how it was described in the different categories. And that seems to be the only differentiating factor because of the fact that land temperature
Yeah.
and intersection density seem to line up otherwise.
I was
Raya?
hoping to
Should we
go
go-
back to
yeah.
the beginning of the
Yeah, why don't we
presentation, we're
actually
kind
go
of
back
off
and
track.
finish the presentation so that we have all of the information to react to? That's a really good idea.
Okay. Now, you all have already seen them. It's not gonna be a surprise anymore. But really, the questions that we want you to consider, which you've already started to talk about and think about,
Which is great.
yeah, that's less work for us. Basically, what we would like to come to as a conclusion on is what combination of the variables better group communities together. And we understand that we don't have policies to compare them based on policy, so it makes it a little difficult in that, but just generally, what combination is better. What could the potential implications be, like policy implications for each combination, and if there's anything very specific that should change. Now, we have these 3 options for you, proposal A, B, and C. These have been distilled based on the previous feedback that we have received from you, the external focus group of local planners, the internal focus group of council staff, and we have narrowed all of the options down to these 3 proposals. They just have different combination of variables. These are mostly not manually changed, except for making sure that any city with an existing orderly annexation area, for that orderly annexation area to have the same designation as the city, but otherwise, a community here and there has not really been changed. That's something that should and will happen. So I want to make sure that you do not focus too much on this one community should change from this to that, because that can certainly happen. But it's more about the bigger picture of what you're seeing, and not making that recommendation based on one community here and there. But that, again, that bigger picture, the message behind that bigger picture, which you've already started to talk about, and what that means, how will it be received, and how can that connect to different policies later on.
And just, for full transparency, there was one change, and that was Fort Snelling. So Fort Snelling kind of came out as its own thing, and that was changed to be part of the urban core.
Yeah.
So, just FYI.
Okay.
Yes.
A lot of development going on there at Fort, no?
Not a whole lot, but there is unfortunately.
Redevelopment
Yep.
and a building started on
And
campus.
housing going in, so that is that is a discussion point for the organization, but.
One thing that I want to mention, just for the record, you see that we are only talking about areas that are within MUSA, because based on conversations, again, with you and other focus groups, it was decided that areas outside of MUSA will retain their current grouping. And I don't want to say they will retain their current community designation because I don't know what those policies are. They may remain the same, they will be slightly different, but basically we want that area will remain generally unchanged. So we have excluded that from all of this conversation so that we can focus on areas within use. So with that, I'm just gonna start going into these proposals. So proposal A, the variables that are included in here are the same variables that were included in the current community designation, what's in Thrive. Except that this shows those variables with the information, like today information. So those variables were updated to show the updated data, basically. And this is what the combination of them that comes out. We have tried to look at different groupings, like number of groupings, 5, even like more, less. And with 5 groupings, we have narrowed it down to actually 4 because there were too many outliers. So the final result of this combination of variables is the 4 groupings that you have that with the description. And as Paul mentioned, we're not saying any kind of community designation name because that is something that is not really technically decided yet. You can come up with different ones if you want, if you don't like the one that already exists, it's up to you. So that's proposal A, and I would like to go through them, but if you have questions, I'll stop and answer questions.
So, and I apologize if I missed earlier conversations. One of the things that this has is that % developed. And to me, living in a community that is highly developed, we really just don't have space. Everything that's going to happen for us is going to be redevelopment. Very, very little new development. And for me, I see that as a critical factor from a policy perspective of what are my rules or regulations and how are you going to guide things, because guiding new development is very different than guiding redevelopment. And so when I look at it, I see that as an important variable to consider. And so, and if we only get those 3 options, to me, then I lead to A unless that variable can be added into others with something else on top of it. Or somebody can tell me that, oh, because I look at, because housing age obviously is also tied to redevelopment, but it doesn't necessarily tie to how much of your land is used, right? Because I'm only looking at the age of what portion is built.
Well, and we had this discussion at the last meeting that there's a whole lot of the region that is 100%.
Yeah,
Right.
it became almost binary except for the very suburban edge. Either you were very low, like below 50%, or you were in the 90s.
Okay.
And so the differentiation became very minimal.
Got it. Okay.
You kind of had this donut effect. So that was one concern about what that level, including it, would show.
So if, that variable would be, allow you to stratify the communities better using other variables, but that % of development would still be highly aligned to some of those other available variables included in that?
Oh, certainly,
Okay.
yeah.
And Paul, some aspect of the information related to percent developed is it part of the forecast model? To some extent, like the land supply, I suppose is.
Not really at this point. I mean, yes, we are looking at land availability, but it's more based on current observed land use. It is based on communities' current guidance. And then it's using a model that is looking at housing type and what's available where and all of that, so.
'Cause, our conversation becomes, okay, yes, if this is what Met Council is projecting our population to be, where the heck are we gonna put these people? Because there isn't any place left to put them.
Well, and Edina said that at the last forecast update, and it ended up that they're putting stuff all around Southdale, and
Yeah.
it's.
Far exceeding what anyone.
Up we go.
imagined.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they didn't think they had any place, but it turns out
They had
did.
places, yeah, okay.
Yeah, and Burnsville's been redeveloping
Yep.
dead strip malls, and so,
Yeah, I
yeah.
think parking lots have become prime.
Huge development projects.
Yeah, we've done some pretty big, 4-story buildings.
That sounds like what I get all the time. Hold on! It's gonna blot out the sun.
I'm like, whoa, 4
If I
stories.
could,
You attended our planning commission meetings.
I would be curious, what the last 10 years and where cities were to the outcome, same on affordable units. I mean, the conflict, hey, that I can't make that number, and see where cities ended. That would give us some indicator looking forward with some other changes.
Kind of a trend and pattern.
Yeah, and maybe we're not to densities yet, I know, but designation.
I just had a clarifying question. Are you talking about where they were in the density and then where they're gonna end up? Is that what you?
Yeah, what was projected
Okay,
10 years ago.
10 years and where we're at in reality, and show where, because the market again, with Edina, the market's working it out very
Yeah.
easily,
And
thank you.
we have a report every year, I think, that shows that for a bunch of communities that report that to us. And you actually get credit for that if you want to go below it on some other developments. But most communities have been way above their minimum densities. And then there's a few outliers that have only had single family and no apartments built because there just isn't demand yet. I mean, Lakeville went through that. We had 30 years where all of the apartment buildings were subsidized. We had no market rate new apartment buildings for 30
Until
years.
now.
And now we've got them coming out our ears. They're everywhere.
Or if you've got like an Andover who refuses to build anything, that's not a large lot, single family.
Well, they do weird things with their lots too, because most communities put ponds and things in outlots, and they draw the yard lines right into the pond, which
Yeah.
makes the yards bigger than they really are. I don't know what
Yeah.
the reason is for that, but yeah. Go ahead.
go ahead, okay. Any other questions on this one?
No, but thank you.
Okay. So the second option before you is replacing, I'm sorry, I just realized that I have covered a word there. Replacing the percent developed that we were just talking about with planned residential density. This is again from the conversations that we had, that planned residential density is potentially a better indicator of where the cities are, where the cities see themselves, because these are coming from the 2040 plans, and potentially more helpful in carrying forward whatever their current vision is for their community. Everyone seemed to connect better with the planned residential density as a potential variable, including like our external focus group. And it seemed to make sense for them in that sense that, yes, like I understand that. And one of the other things is that something like planned residential density, like this data wasn't available before. Percent developed may have been the best that we could get, but now we have this information that we can consider as a basis for the policies in the future. So when you switch the two, then it gives you a little bit of a different grouping. And again, like one or two communities here and there, it's not a big deal. Like they can change if it seems out of place, like in the middle of nowhere, it's like too high of a of a category. But basically like focusing on certain areas in the region, like if you were to look at maybe kind of like the very first ring suburb outside of the western suburbs, for example. If you go towards Lake Minnetonka communities, what does that mean? How are they grouping? Are they grouping with like the category below them or with the category above them? Again, one or two of them here or there, not a big deal. We can work on that and make sure that it represents the groupings the best way possible. But here is the change with planned residential density. And I want to stop right here and see if there are any questions.
Well, I'll just add, as you can see with all the maps in front of you, there's not a whole lot of difference between A and B. It really, it does come down to that there's a lot of similarities. So, Councilmember Geisler, your concern about, could you still imply built or percent developed? I think you certainly could when we get to that point of describing these different groupings. But as you can see, kind of the bigger point that really comes apart is the Lake Minnetonka communities. And in some of the focus groups, we had some people that were like, well, we're all the same, we should all be within the same grouping. But when you really look at them and look at their densities and the type of housing, they are very different. Excelsior is very different than Woodland. And so, there probably is some value in treating them differently. I think some people understood that, others still have perceptions that, whether it's there or maybe it's, around the northeast first ring suburbs of Shorewood and all that, we're all or Shoreview, they view themselves as very similar because they're very close to each other. But yeah, I just wanted to point out, as you can see, there's a lot of similarity, and so we certainly can talk about them together. When we did lump all four variables together, it just kind of created two categories. I mean, it really it didn't add much to the clustering.
Raya.
And to add to what Paul said in terms of like say Lake Minnetonka communities being so different, in the last round, they're all the same category, the same community designation. And we did see through the 2040 comprehensive plan, for example, that some of those communities truly had trouble meeting their minimum density requirements and meeting the minimum policy requirements basically for their community because they were so different from their neighbor who was just having no issue whatsoever with their minimum density requirements. So this kind of helps potentially address some of those challenges that we had in the last round in saying, no, let's make sure that this is realistic and make sure that moving forward you don't have issues.
I'm gonna do my best Elvis impersonation. Do we get caught in a trap we can't turn back? Come on. For the young ones in the room, Elvis was But my point here is that you're using previously planned density in order to make some of the designation.
Get the feedback loop.
Yeah, that's right. So now I'm caught in a trap and I can't turn back of we want to change or whatever, but I may be designated. I mean, again, there's always amendments to go through, but I just get concerned of you get handcuffed, or the communities may get handcuffed by previous comp plan designations, and either with an allocation change of the density or the population or whatever, or just changes in a council that has changed the way that they want to view their community. You get trapped by using previous designations. Does it give communities ample opportunity to change their view of what they want and where they want to do it? That would be my only concern with B. Although I agree with I'm liking that change. I'm just concerned about the ability to. I don't want to repeat Elvis says it like 15 times, so I can say it.
Do you foresee any risk of communities that would say, I'm gonna get rid of all of my high density residential designations and go, and ratchet those down or put limits on, high density is no more than 20 units per acre for our city, that would then allow them to manipulate their designation?
Raya.
So, a few things that I would say. First, while we're like diving very deep into every variable, later on, when these community designations are adopted and policies are associated with them, to be honest, people will not be diving in too deep and remembering what the variable was, as they didn't do that for the previous
Okay.
round either. Like it was just,
It's
this is
more
your
of,
community designation.
Are they in the right buckets?
Right.
Yeah.
In terms of potential risk and maybe misuse of
So
the
it's kind of like
system or
security by
manipulating.
obscurity because.
Right. I would say that a lot of these changes, like yes, you can change your minimum of your high density range from 30 to 20. It's not gonna make such a huge difference that's gonna move you from one bucket to
Okay.
another probably. But at the same time, one of the things that we will be looking at for the density evaluation is just making sure how, where communities are and how these groupings can potentially change that. And then later on, when minimum density requirement policies are being discussed, like next year as part of the land use policies, it will be considered as to how is this going to impact you? Are you all of a sudden being asked to go from minimum of 3 units an acre to a minimum of 20 units an acre? That's just unrealistic. However, if it is like from 3 to 5 and we have all of this data to back up that you are in fact building at that level, then you can accommodate that kind of a minimum density. Again, those conversations are for next year, and part of the density is, as we talked a little earlier, is connected with forecast as to whether or not you'll be able to meet the forecasted growth.
Yeah, because correct me if I'm wrong, the comp plan for adoption has to meet the population growth, correct? In order to be adopted, come
Yes.
through, so
But
they
it's
couldn't say, no, we're not gonna do it, because
Well, it's a
the plan has to-
negotiation.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it gets adjusted on a lot of people's plans. What you can't do is what Lake Elmo did and
Yes.
said, we're gonna do
this is great, we're
You
gonna
know,
ignore it. Yeah.
40% of what you said, although you already put in all of the pipes and roads and everything, we're now gonna not come anywhere close. That was what, I mean, they get adjusted by several hundred units all the time. But if you decide you're just not gonna do it, that's another issue.
I guess, you know, because I've literally had some folks on council, well, we shouldn't do any more high density, we should get rid of that designation, we should take it off, and literally, and it's like, and I'm fearing for November and beyond that we're gonna be leaning way more in that direction.
They might do that until they need assisted living or elderly housing.
But I'm telling, builders
Yeah.
are switching just significantly because of cost.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
You can
mean,
put all the single family in one building, because I can't sell it.
right, yeah, I mean, we literally had a developer come in, it was a perfect spot, it was a, you know, nice big site that's a dilapidated strip mall that has 2 things in it and has been dead for 20 years. And it's like, yay, we have a proposal. And the majority of the council was like, it's an apartment complex. Even market rate, we don't want it. We won't even have a conversation.
And, you know, that's fine, it'll just sit there.
And I'm like,
Right.
And you're gonna be, councils will be penalized.
yeah.
And down that road, the market is the market, and you cannot.
right, it's like, yeah, I want Disneyland there too, but that's not gonna happen, right?
So
We
that
all have our
goes
tax capacity conversations.
Yeah.
Exactly, exactly.
what happens is then your neighbor gets it and it turns out to be great for the tax base and everybody likes it and it doesn't cause crime. And then people start telling the elected officials, hey, wait a minute, how come we don't have that?
Can you come to my next council?
That's so true.
The other thing that prevents the scenario of a community just suddenly changing all their density requirements is that I believe that is something that's a comp plan change that has to go to that council.
And it's not like the Met Council isn't gonna know about it.
Right, yeah,
So that will help.
yeah,
You sort
they'd
of-
know, but we certainly could have
Coming under the radar.
the changes, you know?
Yeah.
But-
Yeah, and, I mean, this is not to the level of detail of what are you actually gonna build? This is just about the buckets.
Yeah.
Paul?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to respond to Councilmember Morris's comment
You have to sing it.
about the density. I mean, yes, there were, in the focus groups, there was concern about, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy by including it. But someone else made a comment that, well, another perspective of it is that it's a reaffirmation of what cities have already wanted within their plans, because they've already set guidance for this. So that's another way that some members were looking at. It's like, yeah, I can see it's self-fulfilling, but at the same time, it's reaffirming what we have already put in place. So just wanted to throw that out there for consideration.
Because you used the 2040 plan
Yes.
density,
Yeah.
right?
Where it was available,
Yeah.
yes.
Because we don't know what the 2050 plan is.
Right.
Okay, if no other questions, we can move to proposal C. Of course, we already talked about it, so it's not new. So proposal C adds the land temperature data to what proposal B was, so planned residential density and land temperature. In this case, there were enough differentiation between the categories that the number of them remained 5. You still see 5 different categories. You see how they're different around the region. Some a little more prevalent than others in the groupings. Again, one community here or there is not a concern at this point, just overall combination and whether or not it makes sense. As we already talked about it, there has been quite a bit of conversation on this proposal regarding whether or not to include the land surface temperature, and a lot of hesitation, to be honest, in terms of feeling like this is the right combination of variables. So I'll just put it out here for any additional conversation on this combination of variables.
Yourself. For me, it's not as much as the variables, but looking to say, is there a reason and purpose that my policies require the stratification of 5 different statements? And will my policies need, having 5 designations give me the flexibility I need in putting a policy together? Or is there going to be such little differentiation between a couple of the groupings to try and say, how do I change that policy? That it makes more sense to say, nope, I have more clarity in my policy with 4 groupings than 5.
And this basically gets you back to the emerging suburban edge versus suburban edge, and I think those can pretty much have the same policies. I didn't see a huge difference between those communities, enough to have a whole separate category.
Right, because if it's a whole separate category and 95% of the policy is the same, is there really the energy and effort to manage one more category? Or is
Yes.
it?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Good point.
Well, and I think this one definitely does change a number of communities, sort of just in that second tier outside of the core cities, or the third tier, to, a lower category, I guess, for lack of a better way to say it. And so you do get more of a transition from sort of a higher category to a lower category with nothing in between in a couple of areas, especially like the northwest and some of the southwest and southern suburbs, and actually even some of the eastern suburbs. So I don't know. I wonder if that having sort of a low category next to a high category, we're missing some nuance there. But that could also be something we could accomplish with 4 categories and just kind of shifting around some of the parameters perhaps to move some of those in-between or middle category cities back into maybe a more appropriate middle area rather than too far down on the scale. But if there isn't too much difference in the policies for the lowest two categories as an example, then why have two?
No, yeah, they are pretty similar, other than how
Yeah.
much developed they are, it was basically the same stuff, right?
Yeah, and the current Thrive community designations, at least for the minimum density requirements, the low ones, which are emerging suburban edge and emerging suburban edge in Thrive, those have the same minimum density requirements. So, which if you think that that is one of the most, I wanna say important, but that is the most significant, one of the most significant policies associated with land use, then you could say that there isn't any difference between those currently. That's not to say that there can't be any difference moving forward, but at the moment, those categories are similar.
Well, and when I look at these communities, like down in my neck of the woods, Farmington, Rosemount are separate now, in the last map from Lakeville, and they were for the last Thrive thing. But they're going through a lot of the same stuff. All three have old downtowns that are redeveloping, and portions of the community that, you know, have lost their significance and have to redevelop into something else. But they're also doing a whole lot of greenfield development, so having them in different categories doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. You live there too.
I would agree.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I would almost at this point say, okay, I'm gonna now take a swat at the policies and look at them and say, how would I break them down into 4 categories or 5? And kind of reverse engineer it and say, if I can't justify and have a good conversation with the city of why I'm in category 4 versus 5, or 3 versus 4, you know, because 4 and 1 are gonna be in 1 regardless, right? All the way through, right? It's really when you get, you know, it's that
The middle
3,
ones.
4, 5
Yeah.
is really, or the 3, 4 gets pushed into 3. If you can't give a good articulation of why I'm in one of those buckets, and I could have a much better conversation with 2 buckets, you go with the 2 buckets. You know, it just will save a lot of time and headache, and it's clearer and cleaner.
So in the situation that we don't know what those policies are, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, we've got policies today,
Yes,
you know, and that's probably a good approximation of what a policy might be.
There's been some major changes in the last 10 years. I mean, before we always thought we were gonna keep adding more areas to transit and it was gonna get bigger, and that's not really looking like it's gonna happen with the trends that we have in the workforce and whatnot.
Yeah.
So some of the things that were relevant before maybe aren't going to be as relevant
Yeah.
this time.
I mean, it's all swag, right?
Yeah. Other thoughts?
One other question, Madam Chair. Does distance from, average distance from services factor into this system at all, or is that just a different conversation?
if by system you mean like transit ways specifically, because the other system is the wastewater system, and this is within MUSA, so all of this area is served. And the other one would be potentially highways, which have not been taken into consideration here, and or parks, which again have not been taken into consideration because they have their own policy plans. But also transit ways were not taken into consideration in this combination that you see. They will have their own place even in the land use policies, like in terms of like minimum density requirements around station areas and so forth, but not in the current combination of proposals.
They were considered, but the groups felt like there again was a self-fulfilling prophecy that if you don't have transit, then there's no way of having an opportunity to gain transit. If we include that in part of the designation, so it definitely was considered.
It's services, is that what you meant, or are you thinking like grocery
Even-
stores
well,
and gas
that's part of-
stations?
Yeah, part of what I meant, but yeah, even more broadly, like, I'm just curious how the map would change with, average distance to a grocery store. Because I think that would be fascinating, but again, I don't want to assume
Yeah.
that that's any part
We
of
did not
this.
break it down to that level by any means, especially that since that goes at the local decision-making process and like whether like what the different ordinances are in this community versus the other, how it's allowed, distance from the other grocery store, it would get too complicated and also changes enough that it just didn't make sense to include it in this long-range policy tool.
And is there good data on that even?
Right.
We might be able to do it, but how useful would it be? You know, I mean, for me, I've got a whole lot of grocery stores available in other communities and in my community within a short drive from my house. But in the city of Lakeville, there are parts of town that have to go a little farther. I go less than a half a mile to the grocery store, but there are some people who might have to go 2 or 3 miles depending on where they live in the community, so it's kind of hard to quantify, I would think.
Unless we maybe go to the sub-region, which was a consideration, but we decided not, or sub-community level.
Community, yes, having like a community, having multiple community designations within MUSA, which we ruled out due to,
There's too much work.
it would have been like council kind of getting into a little too far into the local planning process because we did not think that we'd allow it.
Keep it
But
simple.
and communities really do have local control. A lot of people bully themselves saying that we're telling them what to do, but unless it's a substantial departure from a regional systems plan, we can't say no, we're
Well, I
required
use
to.
my council all the time for this.
I was
Yeah.
gonna say, you get a higher density
When it
to
works for
the
you,
public,
yes.
the Met Council's forcing it.
Yeah.
I mean,
And we
it's
realize
okay.
that happens all the time, and most of the time we don't care, except for when Hennepin County yells at us about Southwest LRT.
But there's value in that a little bit sometimes for NIMBY folks.
Right.
Of
Yeah,
having
yeah.
a little bit of a different entity that takes a little pressure off the local. But I think that the services question was really interesting, if I think about that, because the designation wouldn't necessarily drive the service, because it would be the zoning within that designation, and then the policies within that would drive that. So it's a little,
It'd be
kind of like
the
those
data that you could
self-fulfilling
pull from.
prophecy, but there's a little of chicken and egg, what comes first, from, if we think just from a transit standpoint. Well, they're not coming until we build it, but in order to build the high density, I'm gonna want that, I want the transit, so it's a little chicken and egg. I don't know that into the designation may become problematic.
Just a comment, I keep telling our administrator, we have to come up with a story. We've approved gazillions of multi-housing that'll come out of ground this fall and summer, but we don't have a good story to explain it to the consumer on the street to understand. Builders are reacting to the market. We know we need the diverse housing stock for broad section of population, but we don't have a good story that we're articulating.
Make one up.
Well, yeah.
So we put our story into our comp plan, so we put it right in there. It
But
said
people
50.
aren't gonna read, I'm
Right.
just saying, the 3-minute line that I can explain. Do you want college kids to live in your community? Yes, no, you better have some type of
Someone's gonna have to
multi-housing.
Oh, wow.
It's really
I always
troubling.
use Richfield as an example. They originally were all single family.
Yes.
And there wasn't any choices for people. You got old, you didn't have anywhere to go, you were starting out, you didn't have anywhere to go, so you have to have choices for
You
people.
have that life cycle.
You know, that's a good one, and you buy a house in Richfield, and they're off the charts.
I think in terms of looking at B or C, B starts to make a little more sense to me because just thinking about similarities between communities, just almost more subjective than anything else. It seems to group like communities more appropriately together than C does. So that's, I guess, kind of where I'm leading, and it does tend to address the issue around Lake Minnetonka. I mean, I think that, like just looking at, obviously, we don't always want to get to specific communities, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of similarity between, Plymouth, Minnetonka, and Eden Prairie, which shows up in B, which they're in two different categories in C, and I'm not sure that that makes sense for my thought process as to why would those communities be in two different categories. And so, just kind of looking at it from that perspective, it seems to make the most sense to look at the approach for B.
I see lots of nodding heads.
I agree, all in favor?
Sounds like we have everybody who likes B the best, raise your hand. How about you, Jerry? Which one do you like the best?
Chooses D. Is there a way to mix, to put in some land temperature in?
Now you lost. All I can say is that this topic is really foreign to me. Because you see, where I come from, there's no multiple unit housing, there's no low income housing. So all these issues and categories and everything else that you guys have been discussing is foreign to me. So do I know which plan is better? No, I have really
And that's okay.
no idea.
You're our rural
I'm not
expert, so.
an expert on things, but I do know things are changing in the cities here. Like, I think you mentioned Burnsville, there used to be a huge shopping center, they're tearing it up and putting in housing. Yes.
Burnsville had 1,000, we had like 3,200 people added in the last 10 years. Burnsville had 45. They were fully developed, so how'd they outgrow us? By multi-housing.
Yeah, the difficult to develop parcels that they had listed as like office headquarters sort of things, they finally said, you know what, we're never gonna get an office headquarters here,
Correct.
so let's let it be apartments, and they went,
Yeah.
And it was just dramatic, and that's not the mall that's sitting vacant with Sears, Macy's, and all that.
yeah, they haven't even started putting housing there
Putting,
yet.
so hey, they have more growth opportunities than Greenfield.
But I mean, do cities really want all that growth?
You know what it is? All the old housing stock in Burnsville gives all those empty nesters an option to move to multi-housing that they want anyway. And it's
So the people who
finally,
don't wanna use a yard.
finally it
anymore.
emptied out, and you see the older housing stock investments, younger families moved in the last decade that came about finally.
Yeah, we had between 2000 and 2010, our community grew by like 45 people. I mean, and it was basically very stagnant, not a lot of multifamily being developed. We had almost a 10% growth between 10 and 20. And we did do a lot of multifamily, but a lot of that hasn't come online yet. A big part of what happened too, though, was that we had a lot of households that were 1 and 2 people. A lot of times 1.5 people, just by averages, because it was a lot of seniors aging in place in the home that they built in the 50s. And now we've started to actually have population growth in our single-family homes, because those are transitioned to families.
The
with
people that have
kids,
kids in the
and
home,
now
yeah.
suddenly the population grows that way. But the multifamily added, so it's multi-pronged as to how you grow like that. And sometimes, I mean, I think our original projections in the early 70s for Roseville was to grow to be like, 45,000 people by this time. And of course, it didn't happen because everybody kind of just settled into where they were. And it did take that transition to finally get to a point where we're starting to grow again.
And I would add that our multifamily, if we added 7 major projects multifamily, and of those 7, 6 of them are senior. So from a standpoint, I mean, the population, but it was aging in place. They were Woodbury residents, they never wanted to leave. And so the multifamily was not necessarily market.
And you have to look, the Met Council adjusted everyone's number with the housing collapse, so seniors were trapped there because they lost 1/3 of their value. Now it recovered, it only took 5 years in some places, about 8 in others. But as soon as these values have gone up, now they're quickly, if they're not forced into one level type living, they're quickly moving.
I know, I'm trying to keep my mom from moving in.
Well,
then
But
you have
You're staying in the house.
There are a lot of people who were elderly and living somewhere else that move into these units to be
Yeah.
close to their
Correct.
kids.
Yes, yes.
There's an
yes.
apartment building that just opened up like a year ago, 3 blocks from my house. My mom's been eyeing that for when she needs to move back from Arizona to be closer to the kids, that she wants to live there, so. I mean, there's a lot of dynamics to that. Jerry?
What I've heard today from a bunch of you guys is that you're welcoming apartment buildings. Well, but what I also hear is that your cities are built up, so you have no place to build anymore. So you're tearing down old things. Well, what I see in what Carver County is, you talked about builders are going to multi-unit. Carver County, you don't see new apartments, you see single-family housing. So you see, it's certainly different in county cities by cities. So from where I come from, I don't see apartment buildings, I see single-family housing. So what you're going through is totally different than Carver County, because they got the land to build whatever. There's nothing there now except corn or something.
Well, so I
So
would-
they can, but it's not apartments going up, it's single-family housing.
I'll just mention Umore Park's 5,000 acres and they sold it the last day of last year, 430. We've approved over 1,300 units this year already. 80% are townhomes and apartments on Greenfield.
Yeah.
Now, part of it is County Road 42, it's busy. It's next to the college. The interior will be single family. We have never in 50 years, we've been the opposite, 70 single, 20 to 30 townhomes, but it's the market. Pulte's in there and developers, they can't, it's hard to keep a single family home at 400 grand.
Yeah.
So, and I'm telling you, that market is changing. I don't see prices coming down either.
Well, and density is coming to Carver County, because, I mean, Chaska's been building apartments in townhomes for a long time.
Where's the apartments? I
I've
mean,
seen
there's a few out on 41,
Yeah,
up by, up on top up there. But other than that, I don't
But
see them.
usually in the development timeline, single family comes first, and then the other more dense stuff comes later.
But you gain density with single family too, because you're going from a farm field with one house on it
Yeah.
to a bunch of houses, which then ups your density right there.
yeah.
I could show you in Inver Grove Heights, even in single family, the lots, they're going more up
They're
than
getting
5 feet
Yeah.
off.
I'm
Yeah,
5 feet, a lot of my property
Instead
is
of
5
30,
feet.
It's a lot.
10 and 5, but it's price and cost and infrastructure, it is bizarre.
But it's also, I would also think that, well, I know, that it's also part of policy, right? So when we've got greenfield development, which we've got a ton of, we're doing that. By policy, we're saying from a city standpoint, it's 50-50 mix, 50 single family, 50 multi. And so we move that density around and give density bonuses in order to get that mix. So we'll give a developer, yeah, you gotta do 200 single families and we'll give you density bonus for doing a multifamily project in order to hit that number. So we're incenting, by doing that, we're incenting developers to build a multifamily. They may or may not, depending on, because we are shoehorning them in with really, really low setbacks but to try to get the density in there, but to Dan's point.
And I'm
It's a
guessing
policy thing.
everything is a PUD.
Master plans and
No,
PUDs.
it is, and even out in
Nope.
rural, you're gonna see that everything's a PUD as you slowly.
We strongly oppose any state change to use of POD.
Right.
We don't use them anymore.
Okay,
I
Raya's
just
turn.
wanna
Out of
say,
everything we do.
just as a point about Carver County, in all of these proposals, you see the communities in Carver County come in the same kind of type of grouping on the lower side because they have that kind of characteristics, greenfield development, generally lower density, and different kind of connectivity of roads than the super dense area. So the different proposals in terms of, like at this point in the process, not knowing the policies, either of those proposals don't make a difference in terms of for Carver County area purposes in this case. It happened to be the case, so.
When I look at proposal A and B, like, Crystal is darker in A, but it's really more aligned with New Hope and Golden Valley and Brooklyn Center in terms of its development, so that seems to make sense to me. And same thing in West St. Paul, South St. Paul, you've got them different in proposal A, but they're the same in B, and to me, those two communities are pretty much indistinguishable, you know? So I think B is the one that makes the most sense.
May move forward?
Yes.
So I guess, let me just confirm this. The majority, most people said B or abstain. Okay.
That's
right,
B.
I'll go with the majority and go with B.
Perfect. The reason is that now that we have a direction from you, you're not at this point recommending this yet. This is us getting the direction
It's just
from you.
strong feedback.
Yes, thank you. We will be finalizing this option with some of the granular information, like this one community should not come out this way, and just because we have to align the math with the policy a little bit. And so we will be finalizing that. We intend to ask local governments for feedback on these groupings. Now we have to make sure that that ask is clear and not confusing because there are no policies associated with them at this point. So we're gonna work on that to see how we can best facilitate that feedback. And then, as I mentioned before, we will be evaluating minimum density requirements, so we were hoping to bring that to you in the next meeting and just kind of talking about that as a point of discussion. At this point, we are still hoping that in the next meeting, maybe we'll be able to bring you the final results that you can actually make that will be an action item for you to make a recommendation, but we will work with Chair Wolf and making sure that the project in fact is where it should be for that, but we still have some room for it to not be the next meeting, but maybe the one after that. So that's all we had for today. Any additional question, discussion, feedback?
I want to say thank you to
Contact.
everybody for having such a good
Yes.
discussion. You were all involved, and that's wonderful when everybody
Lovely.
gets involved.
I don't know if you said, but just for your information, when we worked with the external and the internal focus group, they both also kind of agreed with
Yeah.
choice B
Yep.
for that, though there were some people voting for A also.
It's disappointing that we ended up agreeing with that.
Yeah, if
You want to change your vote now,
if the direction was different than what you have received, we would have wanted to get a little more feedback and try to make sure that we're building consensus amongst different groups, but it's lucky for us that everybody is kind of coming to a place that we can easily move forward.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any last words before we finish up?
Can you discuss something that I know something about next time?
You now know more about it.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody.
Do you have a
No
date for the
further-
November meeting?
What?
A date for the November meeting?
The third Thursday, what is that?
Is that Thanksgiving then?
No, it can't be, is it?
Close. It's close to it.
Okay, yeah, because Thanksgiving is it's the last Thursday, and sometimes it's the third,
Yeah, it's
sometimes.
not,
So
it's not Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving is
Okay.
the 24th,
Okay.
and our meeting is on the 17th, so we're the week
17th.
before
Thank you.
Thanksgiving. So, yay, everybody can be here, I hope, okay.
Move to adjourn?
Yes, meeting is.
Thank you.